Imagine a city that begins with just a few inhabitants and, over the course of centuries, becomes the most powerful civilization the world has ever known. Rome, an empire that, from its birth on the banks of the Tiber River, left an indelible mark on history. But how did it go from being a small village to dominating the fate of almost the entire known world? What decisions marked this rapid rise? Today, we will explore the origin of Rome, the struggles that defined it, and the men who, through their decisions, changed the course of the empire forever. Don't go away, the best is yet to come. Join me as we unravel the secrets of ancient Rome. The history of Rome begins in two very different versions, one mythical and one more realistic, based on archaeology. According to legend, Rome was founded in 753 BC by the twin brothers Romulus and Remus. The brothers, who were abandoned by their evil uncle and raised by a she-wolf on the banks of the Tiber River, grew up with a monumental destiny. After reclaiming their grandfather's throne, they decided to found a city. But, as often happens in the stories of great empires, the twins' fate was not simple. During the city's construction, Romulus, after an argument, ended his brother Remus' life, marking the beginning of a Rome full of tension and conflict. However, the real story of Rome's founding is a little different. Archaeology shows us that the area was already inhabited long before the mythical date of 753 BC. What we know for sure is that Rome began as a series of small settlements on the hills of the Tiber region, which gradually came together to form a city. But who were these first inhabitants of Rome, really? Probably not the mythical twins, but a mix of indigenous peoples who united under a single flag. Rome, therefore, was not born from a single person nor in a single day, but as a small collective project that grew due to the need for survival and the circumstances of the time. As Rome began to establish itself as a city, its first steps were guided by a series of kings, some legendary, others more mysterious. The first of these was Romulus, who, after killing his brother, became the first king of Rome, starting a dynasty that would last for 7 generations. However, not all the kings were the same, and far from all of them were Roman. In fact, the last 3 kings of Rome came from the Etruscan civilization, a neighboring and highly influential culture during Rome's early years. The Etruscan influence was crucial. These kings brought with them a series of reforms in the city, both in urban structure and in the army, but they also left a legacy of tyranny. While Rome prospered, the relationship between the monarchs and the people grew increasingly tense. This pressure culminated in 509 BC, when the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was expelled by the Roman citizens, fed up with his authoritarian rule. The fall of the monarchy was not simply the end of a government, but the birth of a new era in Rome, the Republic. A system where citizens would have more voice, and the institutions would begin to take a more democratic form, or at least, that's what it seemed. With the fall of the monarchy, Rome entered a new stage, one in which power would not reside in the hands of a single king, but in a complex system of institutions, the Republic. Instead of an absolute monarch, the Romans established a government composed of consuls, magistrates, and a senate, with the intention of avoiding the tyranny that had marked the monarchy. But not everything was simple. In the Republic, there were 2 predominant social classes, the Patricians, the noble and wealthy families, and the Plebeians, the rest of the population. Although the Plebeians were the majority, the Patricians controlled the key institutions and had access to the highest political positions, while the Plebeians, despite being citizens with the right to vote, were excluded from positions of power. This imbalance of power created tensions for centuries. The plebeians pressed the patricians for more rights and access to public office, fighting for reforms such as the creation of the tribune of the plebs, who defended their interests against the abuses of the patricians, and the enactment of the 12 Tables, a legal code that put the laws in writing, which had previously only been known by the patricians. Over time, the plebeians achieved important victories, and by the 3rd century BC, they even began to be elected as consuls, breaking the patrician monopoly on the main government institutions. But while internal tensions continued, Rome began to expand. It was not only fighting against its nearby neighbors, but its military and diplomatic victories began to give it power and influence across the region. Despite internal tensions, the Roman Republic began to expand rapidly, extending its dominance across the entire Italian peninsula and beyond. The Romans not only fought against their neighbors, but also devised a political strategy that allowed them to turn their enemies into allies. In this way, the defeated peoples were not only subjugated but often integrated into the Roman system as allies and partners, securing resources and manpower for continuous expansion. But the real test for Rome came with the arrival of Carthage, a rival empire competing for control of the western Mediterranean. The Punic Wars marked a crucial stage in Roman history, and the most well-known of them was the Second War, where the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, with his army and elephants, almost managed to defeat Rome. But Rome, as always, proved unstoppable. Despite initial defeats, the Romans regrouped and eventually defeated Carthage. This victory not only consolidated Rome's power but also marked the beginning of its rise as the superpower of the Mediterranean. Rome gained access to vast territories, valuable resources, and thousands of slaves, strengthening its economy and military. With this victory, Rome transitioned from being a city-state to becoming an imperial power. Not only was Carthage defeated, but Rome continued its expansion across Africa, Asia, and Europe, absorbing cultures, territories, and entire peoples. In fact, Rome had an astonishing ability to incorporate the cultures it conquered, adapting the most useful elements and transforming them into part of its own system. As Rome expanded and grew stronger, the republican system began to show signs of wear. Although there were institutions that distributed power, in practice, Roman politics was dominated by a small number of individuals. The struggle for power intensified, and tensions within the republican government began to strain the foundations of the system. It was in this context that a figure emerged who would change history forever: Julius Caesar. Caesar, a brilliant general, distinguished himself during his campaigns in Gaul, leading Rome to a series of victories that expanded its dominance even further. His popularity grew so much that, upon returning to Rome, he encountered a Senate fearful of his power. In 49 BC, he disobeyed the Senate's orders and crossed the Rubicon, an action that would seal his fate and that of Rome. By saying, "The die is cast," Caesar plunged into a civil war, defeating Pompey, his former ally and rival, and becoming the most powerful man in Rome. Despite his power, Caesar never proclaimed himself emperor, but ruled as a perpetual dictator. During his reign, he implemented a series of reforms that profoundly changed Rome's political, economic, and social structure. However, his ambitions were not well received by everyone. A group of senators, fearing that Caesar would become a tyrant, assassinated him in 44 BC, in one of the most dramatic moments in Roman history. However, Caesar's assassination did not resolve Rome's problems, but rather amplified them. After his death, his adopted son, Octavian, later known as Augustus, faced Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, in a civil war that would culminate in the defeat of his enemies and Octavian's absolute control over Rome. In 27 BC, Octavian was proclaimed Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Although republican institutions still existed in name, real power shifted to Augustus. With him began a new era, the Roman Empire. With Augustus's rise to power, the Roman Empire entered a new era. Under his rule, Rome reached a stability it had not experienced during the last years of the Republic. This period, known as the Pax Romana, lasted for over 2 centuries and allowed Rome to flourish in all aspects, from its economy to its territorial expansion and cultural development. During Augustus's reign and that of his successors, Rome reached its greatest expansion. In the 2nd century AD, under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire reached its largest extent, encompassing territories in Europe, Africa, and Asia, with a network of roads that connected every corner of the empire. Rome not only dominated militarily, but its cultural, legal, and economic influence spread throughout the Mediterranean. However, not everything was perfect. Despite political stability, Rome continued to face internal problems. Emperors grew increasingly powerful, and the figure of the emperor became the center of absolute power. Although the Senate and other institutions still existed, real control passed through the hands of the princeps, the emperor. This concentration of power also fueled internal tensions. The Roman Empire witnessed great achievements in architecture, engineering, and art. Works such as the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Appian Way remained symbols of Roman grandeur. Additionally, the Roman army, known for its discipline and organization, played a crucial role in the expansion and maintenance of the empire. The Roman legions, equipped with the best military technology of the time, ensured the protection of the borders and the continuous expansion of Rome. However, over the centuries, the empire became embroiled in economic, social, and political problems. The centralization of power in the hands of the emperor and the constant succession issues created an environment of instability. By the 3rd century AD, the empire faced a series of internal crises, which were combined with external threats, ranging from barbarian invasions to the growing pressure from the Germanic peoples and other enemies. Although the Roman Empire reached impressive heights, over time, the foundations of its power began to crumble. During the 3rd and 4th centuries, Rome suffered a series of crises that not only threatened its stability but also cast doubt on its ability to remain united. The causes of this decline were multiple and complex, and historians continue to debate which were the most decisive. One of the most severe problems was the economic crisis. Inflation, the collapse of the tax system, and continuous wars drained the empire's resources. Moreover, the increasing pressure from barbarian tribes on the western borders began to erode Roman forces. Attacks from the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns became more frequent, and although Rome was able to withstand some of these assaults, the empire was increasingly weakened. However, external threats were not the only cause of the fall. The Western Roman Empire also suffered from internal divisions. The administration of the empire became more difficult as it expanded, and it was Emperor Diocletian who, in an attempt to restore order, decided to divide the empire into two parts, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, with two emperors ruling each section. Although the division initially seemed like a solution, tensions between the two halves of the empire never disappeared. While the Eastern Empire, with its capital in Byzantium, resisted and prospered, the Western Roman Empire fell into a spiral of decay. The lack of strong leadership, internal power struggles, and rampant corruption left Rome vulnerable to external attacks. Finally, on September 4, 476 AD, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general. This event is traditionally considered the end of the Western Roman Empire. Rome, the city that once dominated the known world, fell to barbarian forces, and the old empire dissolved into chaos. However, the fall of Rome did not mean the end of Roman civilization. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued to exist for almost another 1,000 years, preserving many of the Roman institutions and traditions. The fall of Rome marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new one. Although the Western Roman Empire disappeared, its cultural, political, and legal legacy endures to this day. The system of government, architecture, the Latin language, ideas about law and war, and many other Roman contributions continue to influence our daily lives. Rome was not just a city, it was a civilization that left an indelible mark on history. From its mythical founding by the twins Romulus and Remus to its fall before barbarian forces, the history of Rome is filled with victories, betrayals, wars, and reforms that changed the course of humanity. The question is, what would we have done if we had been in the Roman shoes? Would we have made the same decisions? Could such a great empire have survived the same pressures that destroyed it? Let us know your opinion in the comments. If you were surprised by this story and want to keep exploring more moments that changed the course of history, don't forget to subscribe and share this video. See you in the next episode.